George Mamsarov we interviewed, he was remarkably open and frank, by the way. He was not just like spouting off Kremlin talking points, but he was telling the truth as he sees it down there. And one of the things he said was, I asked him, I said, I thought maybe a year ago, I thought maybe by the end of the summer of 2024, the Ukraine army might just crumble and collapse. And I said, yet here we are, and a year later, and they still aren't. So the question is, will they ever collapse? And he said, well, you got to understand something. He said, the Ukrainians are our Slavic brothers and, cousins, whatever. He said, so we're kind of from the same stock. And he said, and we will fight to the death. He said, the Ukraine side, some of the times they fight the hardest when they're outnumbered and when they're surrounded, et cetera. They just don't quit. And he said, and we give props to them. We recognize that too. So he said, we are operating on the assumption that they're not going to break anywhere, and we may have to just methodically just continue on fighting and destroying their capacity until they just don't have it. But he said that they are just this fierce fighter that just don't know how to quit, no matter how big the odds are. And that's good on the one hand, because you can, say loud that and say, what great fighting spirit. But the downside of that is that prolongs the war and increases the destruction of Ukraine. So I'm not sure that's such a good thing in that situation.
No, I mean, we've seen this before, haven't we? If you think about the Japanese and the Germans, I mean, the German army was exceptional.
Great point. Great point.
With the Japanese, they never gave up either. But what do we end? It didn't make an ultimate difference. It just meant that we were a little bit more careful the way we conducted the war, and the way the Russians conducted the war. Let's not forget that actually in Europe, it was the Russians who were the predominant force and took on and defeated the German army. So I think that's the situation the Ukrainians find themselves in. You cannot help at the tactical level but admire their fighting capability. I'm not entirely surprised. We've seen, I think they used to say with the German army, there were three things in life: death, taxes, and the German counterattack. And you sort of see that in Ukraine as well, don't you? With the sort of they do counterattack, but sooner or later, the power of industrial capacity, the power of energy, and the power of the overwhelming advantage that the Russians have is going to make a difference. It doesn't matter how brave you are and how courageous the teams are; they are going to lose. I think the interesting thing, I'm just slightly. I think we've seen a little bit, and I think Doug McGregor occasionally talks about this, about people, especially families, not wanting their people to go to the front line and trying to avoid that, and there being challenges to the press gangs. And it's whether or not that starts to have some wider impact, and whether or not security services in Ukraine can continue to suppress that. But sooner or later, what the fall looks like, from the sound of it, I, like you, I'm wondering whether there would be a collapse. I don't see signs of that, but what I see is retreat on all areas of the battlefield where the Russians choose to advance. And that might not be a collapse, but you achieve the same thing, just not quite as quickly.
He did tell me, by the way, that, and again, this is pretty frank and open stuff. He said that Pokrovsk is the priority of effort for the Russians. They have an offensive going on in Zaporizhia, another one in Kupiansk, which are supporting elements, but the main focus is on the Pokrovsk, because they feel like if they can get that cut off, whether surrounded or defeated, they think they can unhinge the entire front lines. And he said they do have sufficient operational reserves ready to exploit that and to get through. So we'll see how that transpires, something we're going to keep watching here. Getting back to this situation here, you mentioned a second ago that some in Europe are not keen on having all their money going into basically a bottomless pit of just being thrown away into the trash by giving to Ukraine. One of those, we just showed you Chancellor Merz talking about he wants full integration of the Ukraine and giving them a bunch of stuff that he's been offering here. Everybody in Germany, however, is not so keen on that.
When push comes to shove, you brazenly and shamelessly claim there's no money. In the same breath, you offer the US president to use German taxpayers' money to buy American weapons for Ukraine. Personally, I believe you've already secured your next supervisory board position as a lobbyist, Mr. Merz. And as the crowning insult, you then condescendingly tell the German people that they need to work more.
Now, that's the leader of the AfD, Alternative für Deutschland. So you expect her not to be liking anything Merz does. But they do speak for a lot of Germans who don't like their money going to Ukraine while they themselves are doing without. Is that common among, I mean, rather better question, how widespread do you think that is among other European countries?
I mean, I think we're seeing it in different stages. So, for example, I've listened recently to a really interesting podcast by a team in Holland, where the Munich conference was actually a big peace marches were run outside it. We didn't see much of it in the mainstream media because, of course, it goes against the narrative. The Spanish are clearly much less happy with the situation, whereas others are still ploughing on regardless. I mean, unfortunately, the British, the French, and the Germans seem to be ploughing on regardless. But I do think that sooner or later, in the same way that the Russian army progresses, and as soon as cuts start to happen in critical areas of government spending, in welfare areas, in capital construction, those areas, and they have to happen, or tax rises happen, it's bound to make people think again. Because I think the other thing is that the story is starting to leak out. And 2 hours ago, we sat with a guy that I've only just met, lives in my village, a master mariner, a fascinating man, and doesn't get it in the same way that you and I, because he's not been track it in the same way that we do, but totally open-minded to what he's hearing from us, and very skeptical of the position that's being portrayed in amongst European countries.
Oh, I'm sorry. I thought you were going to.
Yeah, sorry.
It's not just in Europe, it's also in the United States. I don't want to just cast a bunch of dispersions upon the European leaders without also shining a light on some in my own country here. There was some information this morning out that from Jack Keane on Fox News, and he can always be counted on to just say, hey, we just need to give more stuff to Ukraine. The President Trump, in just as kind of context here, kind of went back again on his pledge to cut off some of the support for Ukraine. Now he's going to give some more interceptor missiles. He said, I'm going to give them stuff to defend themselves with. Well, an analysis shows it's a whopping 10 interceptor missiles and a handful of other things, and then they're figuring out what else they can do. The bottom line is we don't have a lot to give, so it's not going to have any impact on the fighting here. But there are some in the United States that want President Trump, and the Washington Post was a key one, where they said he should go back to the Biden era stuff and just open all the gates and give everything so that Ukraine can, quote, defend itself, whatever that means, and they don't ever bother to figure that out. They just want more stuff to go out. Well, to try and buttress that, you had General Jack Keane go on to try to play the same card that they played really earlier in the conflict. Maybe he's going to try and replay it, which is Vladimir Putin is the devil.
He's largely targeting civilians, and he wants to put pressure on Zelensky as a result of that, to make even more concessions going forward. Putin is a defined war criminal. There is absolutely no getting around this. Not only has he committed genocide against mass population, and there's 4 different mass grave sites in different cities that reflect it, but he's targeting civilians in these cities. He targets hospitals and he targets schools. There's no accident that a school gets hit or a hospital. This is all to break the will of the Ukrainian people. The president is on to him. He's given them every chance here to work this. And what he really wants to do is get the president so frustrated, Bill and Dana, that he walks away and doesn't support Ukraine. Well, the president is frustrated. But guess what? He's not walking away.
Okay, first of all, if you want to talk about genocide and committing war crimes, you might want to look at a different world leader in a different conflict. Maybe a guy named Benjamin Netanyahu. Didn't seem to bring that guy into this talk to. But let's first of all, before we go any further on that, let's announce, do you have any knowledge about what Keene's talking about here about this alleged war crimes where there are mass graves in 4 different places that's been documented? I'm not tracking that.
No, me neither. And I think if it were true, it would be all over the press. There's none of it here in this country. It'd be all over the press because people would say, there we are. It just shows you that Putin's a war criminal. that I haven't seen a shred of evidence. And I'm sure that if there was evidence, I'd have heard from it from, for example, from Larry Johnson and those people with good insight. Still, I haven't seen a shred of evidence. I also don't see why it's in Russia's interest. I mean, I think that Keen's argument that he's trying to break the will of the people isn't true. I mean, actually, the Russians, compared to, for example, the Israelis, as you pointed out, have had a very, very low set level of civilian casualties in proportionate terms, and a very low level of civilian casualties compared to the Americans and the British and others in Iraq and in Afghanistan. So the idea that he's trying to deliberately do it, in fact, my strong suspicion, I have no evidence of this, is that he's trying to do the opposite. He's trying deliberately not to target them, and that he's been very careful. I think the fact that we're seeing more attacks now is a result of the foolish attack on the Russian strategic bombers. I think as a result of that, and the change to an anti-terrorist campaign now, what he's trying to do is to win the war possibly a little bit more quickly. But certainly I think the key thing is that it's clear to me that he is determined to win this war militarily. If it happens that something else throws up and we get a good diplomatic deal, I can't see any sign of it. And his situation, I'd be incredibly suspicious of any offer from the West. He's going to win it on the battlefield. I suspect that he's told his armed forces, I think I might have said this a couple of months ago, keep going. This is my intentions. I intend to actually achieve this final security situation. And that when we've done that, then we can stop and take breath. It may be that I ask you to hold back, but don't plan on it. Just keep going, and we'll see where we get to. I think the much more interesting question, I think, because I can't think of any logic or evidence to support what Jack Keen's saying, the much more interesting question is, what does the final situation look like for Russia? I think that's a really interesting situation. I'm coming increasingly around to the conclusion that what it probably means is Novorossiya. In other words, it's the some of the territories west of the Dnieper and running through as far as Transnistria. And the reason I say that is you've got broadly speaking, they're either ethnic Russians in those regions or they're Russian-speaking Ukrainians. And furthermore, they all voted politically in a Russian-leaning way. So that's the way that I'd be thinking about it. I would want to secure those areas. It's very interesting that when he talks about buffer zones, he doesn't talk about securing those regions. And those regions that he's talking about, which are up to the north above Sumy, are actually Ukrainian regions, both ethnically and in terms of language. So that's the way I'd be thinking about it. I think I would struggle to do much more with denazification, but you'll end up with a rump state, which you can contain. You've got the western side of the Black Sea secure, which allows you to be a little bit more flexible in terms of the use of naval forces. But also he'll have his eye on Azerbaijan, what's going there and that relationship, and in the Southern Caucasus, he'll want to make sure that he's got the capacity to actually solve that as well, because it looks again like the West could try to make mischief in the Southern Caucasus.
Yeah, that does appear that it's happening. That's definitely on the Russians' mind. Want to make a quick comment there to one of our viewers there to the BT, said, hey, why don't you get some of these Russian or Ukraine speakers on that say that Ukraine's going to win. You would be surprised, but it's been hard for me to get anybody willing to come on the channel to talk about that. We do have some Ukraine folks from their perspective on. We've had some on before. We're trying to get a couple on in the coming couple of weeks, so keep an eye out for that. But those that say that Ukraine's going to win, I think maybe because they don't think they could stand up to the questioning, they are not willing to come on the show. So it's a little more challenging than you may think.